The moment Fannie Callahan stepped off the stagecoach in Dusk Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1878, she knew with absolute certainty that she had made either the bravest decision of her life or the most foolish one, and she had not yet decided which. The town stretched before her in the punishing afternoon sun, a single main street lined with weathered timber buildings that looked as though they had been dropped there by accident and never bothered to straighten themselves up. A livery stable anchored one end. A saloon with a crooked sign anchored the other. Between them sat a general store, a barber shop, a small church with a bell that hung slightly sideways, and a handful of structures whose purposes were not immediately clear. Dusk Creek was not what the advertisement in the Cincinnati Gazette had described. The advertisement had called it a thriving frontier community with abundant opportunity and fertile land. Fannie had taken that to mean something considerably more impressive than what stood before her now. She was 22 years old, with dark red hair that caught the light like copper in a forge, and green eyes that had a habit of taking in everything at once before her face showed any reaction at all. She carried a single leather trunk, scuffed at all four corners, and a small carpetbag that held her most important belongings. She had a letter in her coat pocket from a man named Gerald Tate, a widowed farmer who had placed a matrimonial notice in that same Cincinnati Gazette, and with whom she had exchanged 4 careful letters before agreeing to make the journey west. Gerald Tate had seemed decent in those letters, measured, respectful. He had described his farm as productive and his needs as simple. He had promised her a home. What greeted her at the stagecoach stop was not Gerald Tate. Instead, a boy of perhaps 12 came running across the dusty street, waving his arms, and skidded to a stop in front of her with a breathless and unhappy expression. "You the bride lady?" he asked, squinting up at her. "I am Fannie Callahan," she said carefully. "I'm expected by Mr. Gerald Tate." The boy pulled his hat off and turned it in his hands. "Yes, ma'am, that is the trouble. Mr. Tate, he had himself a real bad fall 2 days past, off his barn roof. He is at Doc Hendry's place now, and Doc says he likely will not walk right for 6 months, maybe more. He told me to tell you he is sorry, and he is not in a position to receive a wife." Fannie stood very still. The stagecoach driver had already unloaded her trunk and was climbing back up to his seat. The other passengers had dispersed into the town. The street was mostly quiet. A horse tied to a post down the way flicked its tail at the flies. "I see," Fannie said. "He did say he was real sorry," the boy repeated as if this helped. "Yes," she said. "You mentioned that." She picked up her carpetbag and looked at her trunk on the ground and then looked at the street, and considered her situation with the focused calm that her mother had always said was both her greatest strength and her most unsettling quality. She was in a town she had never seen before in the middle of Texas, with approximately $6.40 to her name, no prospect of a husband, no promise of a home, and no route back east that she could afford. Her family in Cincinnati was not in a position to send for her. She had left because she had needed to leave. Her father had died the previous autumn, leaving debts that consumed the house and nearly everything in it. Her older brother had his own family and no room. Gerald Tate's advertisement had seemed at the time like Providence. Providence, it now appeared, had a mean sense of humor. "Is there a boarding house in this town?" she asked the boy. "Yes, ma'am, Mrs. Doyle runs one on the far end of the street there. She is fair and clean." "Thank you," Fannie said, and she picked up one end of her trunk and began dragging it in the direction he had pointed. She had not gotten 20 feet before a voice stopped her. "That trunk will tear your arm out of the socket before you reach the end of the block." She looked up. The man standing a few feet away from her was leaning against the post of the hardware store, arms crossed, watching her with an expression that was not quite amusement and not quite concern, but somewhere in the narrow territory between them. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and weathered in the particular way of men who spent most of their lives outdoors. His hat was dark brown and pushed back slightly on his head, and he had the kind of jaw that looked like it had been carved out of something hard. His eyes were the color of a sky just before a storm, a deep and serious gray. He looked to be somewhere in his late 20s, perhaps 28 or 29, and he wore the clothes of a working man, simple canvas trousers, a worn cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and boots that had seen considerable distance. "I am managing," Fannie said. "You have moved about 3 feet in 30 seconds," he said. "I watched you. Then perhaps you might stop watching and offer to help," she said without particular heat. It was simply the logical next thing to say. Something shifted in his expression. He unfolded himself from the post, walked over, and picked up the trunk as though it weighed nothing at all. "Where are you headed?" "Mrs. Doyle's boarding house," she said, "if you know where it is." "I do," he said, and started walking. She fell into step beside him. They crossed the street and walked along the boardwalk in silence for a moment before she said, "My name is Fannie Callahan." "Vernon Slater," he said. "Thank you for your help, Mr. Slater." "You are welcome, Miss Callahan." They arrived at the boarding house, a 2-story white-painted building that was noticeably better cared for than most of what surrounded it, and Vernon set the trunk down on the porch steps. He touched the brim of his hat in a brief, polite gesture and turned to go. "Mr. Slater," she said. He paused. "Would you happen to know if there is any work available in this town? I find myself needing employment rather urgently." He studied her for a moment, the same unhurried, appraising look he had given her before, without any rudeness in it, only a kind of honest assessment. "Mabel Hurst at the general store lost her assistant last week, and I believe the school may be looking for a teacher. Mrs. Cole retired back in February and they have not replaced her." "Do I look like a schoolteacher?" she asked. "You look like someone who knows what she is doing," he said. "That is usually sufficient." He walked away. Fannie watched him go for just a moment before turning to knock on Mrs. Doyle's door. Adeline Doyle was a stout, practical woman of 50 who smelled of bread and lye soap, and had the manner of someone who had seen every variety of human difficulty and had made peace with all of it. She took Fannie in with a single look, set her up in a small, clean room on the 2nd floor that faced the backyard, and told her the rate was $2 a week including meals. When Fannie explained her situation honestly, including the $6.40, Mrs. Doyle simply nodded and said, "You had better find work quickly then." And that was the end of the judgment. Over supper that first evening, which was a remarkably good venison stew, Fannie learned from Mrs. Doyle and the 3 other boarders what there was to know about Dust Creek. The town had about 300 residents and was growing slowly as the cattle industry pushed further west. There was trouble with a neighboring ranch family called the Harmon brothers, who had a habit of running their cattle over smaller landowners' fences and claiming the land disputes were honest mistakes. Sheriff, a decent man named Abel Cord, was doing what he could, but there were only 2 of him and 3 Harmon brothers, and that math created problems. The land around Dust Creek was good land, rolling and well-watered by a creek that ran year-round. People came there meaning to stay. When she asked about Vernon Slater, a quiet fell over the table that was brief but noticeable. "Vernon runs the Slater spread south of town," Mrs. Doyle said, returning to her stew. "His father built it. Good man. Keeps to himself mostly." "Mostly since Clara," said one of the other boarders, a thin woman named Ida, and then seemed to remember herself and said nothing more. Fannie did not ask about Clara. It was not her business, and she had enough of her own circumstances to occupy her attention. The next morning she put on her best dress, which was a deep blue cotton that was travel-worn but still respectable, pinned her hair up neatly, and went first to the general store. Mabel Hurst was a sharp-eyed woman of 40 who asked Fannie exactly 4 questions, received 4 direct answers, and hired her on the spot at $1.25 per week. It was not much, but it was a start. The general store was the kind of place where half the town passed through in a given week, and Fannie, who had always been quick with names and faces, began to learn the community in that particular way that only comes from watching people choose between 2 grades of flour or debate the merits of one brand of patent medicine over another. She learned who the ranchers were, who the tradespeople were, who was kind and who was difficult and who was carrying sorrows they did not speak of. She was good at her work. She was organized and efficient, and she had a memory for inventory that Mabel praised within the first week. Vernon Slater came into the store 4 days after her arrival on a Thursday morning to pick up a sack of nails and a length of rope. He saw her behind the counter and seemed slightly surprised, then settled into something that might have been approval. "You found work quickly," he said. "I told you I needed it urgently," she said. "So you did." He placed his list on the counter. "I will also need 2 pounds of coffee and a tin of baking powder." She gathered his items without needing to look at her list and tallied the total with a pencil on the paper slip. He paid and then did not immediately leave, which she noticed but did not remark on. "Are you settling in all right?" he asked in a tone that was polite but not casual. There was a carefulness to Vernon Slater that she had noticed from the first moment, the quality of a man who chose his words with a certain deliberateness, as though he had learned the cost of saying things imprecisely. "Well enough," she said. "Mrs. Doyle is kind. The town is smaller than I expected." "Most things are," he said. She handed him his wrapped parcels. Their fingers did not touch, but the exchange was close enough that she was aware of the nearness of his hands, which were large and work-calloused and surprisingly careful with the paper wrapping. "Thank you, Miss Callahan," he said, and he left. She watched him through the window as he crossed the street and loaded his things into a wagon, and then she attended to the next customer, who wanted to know if the new shipment of calico had come in yet. The weeks turned into a month, and the month into 2, and Fannie settled into Dust Creek with the particular determination of someone who has decided that whatever they have landed in, they will make the best of it. She was good company in the evenings at Mrs. Doyle's, and people began to like her in the way that people like someone who is honestly themselves without pretension. She made friends with a woman named Della Marsh, who was the wife of the blacksmith and who had a warm, raucous laugh that could be heard from a considerable distance, and who took it upon herself to introduce Fannie to everyone in town, whether they needed introducing to or not. Through Della, Fannie learned more about Vernon Slater than she had been able to learn from anyone else, because Della had no particular sense that information needed to be withheld simply because it was personal. Clara, she explained, had been Vernon's wife. They had married when Vernon was 24 and Clara 22, and they had been happy in the particular, quiet way of 2 people who fit together without effort. Clara had died the previous winter of a fever that had swept through the region and taken several people before the cold broke. She had been 27. Vernon had been taking care of the ranch alone since then, with only 2 hired hands and a disposition that had turned inward in the way that grief sometimes turns people. "He is not broken," Della said firmly, as though anticipating a conclusion. "He is just still carrying it. There is a difference. Some men go into grief like they go into a hole and never come back up. Vernon is not like that. He is still out there, working, talking to people, doing what needs doing. He just has not figured out yet how to stop measuring the quiet against what it used to sound like." Fannie thought about that for a long time. She had not come to Dust Creek looking for a love story. She had come looking for a husband who could provide stability, for a practical arrangement that would allow her to build something from the rubble of her circumstances. She had not expected to find a man who picked up heavy trunks with quiet competence and spoke in carefully measured sentences, and had storm-gray eyes that seemed to be paying attention to things most people walked past without noticing. She had not expected to find herself thinking about any man in particular, but she found herself thinking about Vernon Slater. In June, there was a barn dance at the Miller farm, which was a 3-mile ride out of town, but which essentially the entire population of Dust Creek attended anyway, because it was the social event of the season, and because Martha Miller made a peach cobbler that had achieved something close to legendary status. Fannie went with Della and Della's husband, Tom, a large, good-natured man who played the fiddle well enough to be in constant demand at such events. The Miller barn was warm and golden with lantern light, and the fiddle and the guitar and the occasional squeeze box made a sound that had no name in formal music, but which was exactly the right sound for a warm June night in Texas. Fannie danced twice with Tom before he was claimed by the musicians, and then she stood near the refreshment table with Della and watched the room. Vernon was there. She had not expected him to be, but he was, standing near the far wall with his hat in his hands, talking to Sheriff Abel Cord in the way that men talk when they are comfortable with each other's silence. He was wearing a clean shirt, a dark blue one, and he had shaved, which changed the architecture of his face in a way that was notable. He looked younger. Not young exactly, but as though some of the weight had been set down temporarily. He saw her across the room and gave a brief nod, the kind that acknowledged without committing to anything further, and she returned it in the same currency. "He is looking at you," Della said, with considerable satisfaction. "He nodded at me," Fannie said. "That is not the same thing." "Honey, for Vernon Slater, a nod is practically a declaration," Della said, and went to get herself more lemonade. Later in the evening, when the music had slowed to something more deliberate, Vernon made his way across the barn in her direction. He moved through the crowd with the unhurried ease of a man who was confident in his own space without being forceful about it, and he arrived beside her without any preamble or performance. "Would you like to dance, Miss Callahan?" he asked. "I would," she said. He was a good dancer. Not showy, not over-precise, but solid and sure-footed, and he held her with the appropriate distance and firmness of a man who respected both the dance and the woman he was dancing with. The music was a slow waltz, which the fiddler played with a melancholy sweetness, and for a few minutes the busy noise of the barn seemed to fall back and give them a small private sphere. "You seem to have made yourself at home here," he said, after they had moved through one full turn. "I tend to plant myself wherever I am," she said. "It seems more practical than wishing I were somewhere else." "That is a useful quality," he said. "It is the only one I was born with," she said lightly, and he did something she had not seen him do before, which was smile. It was a contained smile, not wide or eager, but genuine, and it did something unexpected to his face, opened it up, made the storm-gray eyes warmer, and Fannie felt something shift in the region of her chest that she was not entirely prepared for. "I doubt that is true," he said. The song ended. He stepped back and thanked her for the dance with the same careful courtesy he brought to everything, and she thanked him in return, and they separated back into the general flow of the evening. But something had changed, and she knew it, and she suspected he knew it too. After that, Vernon found reasons to stop by the general store more often than once a week. She did not point this out. She simply had his regular items ready before he could recite his list, and he noticed this and seemed pleased by it in the quiet, undemonstrative way that he seemed pleased by things. They talked. Not at great length, because the store was always busy and there were always other customers. But in the aggregate of those small exchanges, something accumulated that felt increasingly like knowing someone, like learning the shape of a person's thinking, and discovering that you liked the shape of it. He told her about the ranch, 460 acres of good grazing land with a creek that ran clean through the southern pasture, a decent house that his father had built in 1861, and that he had added a room to himself. He ran about 200 head of cattle and a small horse operation on the side that was growing. He spoke about the land with the affection that some people reserve for other people, a quiet, specific love for the particular curve of a hill or the way the light fell in the late afternoon over the west pasture. She told him about Cincinnati, about her father's print shop that had smelled of ink and paper and the particular metallic warmth of the presses, about her mother who had died when Fannie was 15 and who had been a schoolteacher herself before she married, about the way the city had felt after her father died, too full of the shapes of things that were gone. "That is why you answered the advertisement," he said once. It was not a judgment. It was simply the observation of someone who had been listening carefully. "Partly," she said, but partly I was also ready to go somewhere and make something new. I think I would have found a reason to go west eventually. Texas is a good place for new things, he said. I am beginning to think so, she said, and they looked at each other a moment longer than was strictly necessary before Mabel Hurst called from the back room that the new bulk goods had arrived and needed to be counted. In July, the trouble with the Harmon brothers came to a head. It had been building all spring, a sequence of fence cuttings and cattle trespasses that had escalated slowly enough that each individual incident seemed almost manageable until you counted them all together and realized they were not incidents at all but a pattern. The Harmon brothers, 3 men named Cal, Deke, and Rory, ran a large cattle operation north of town and had decided that the land between them and the creek that ran through the southern properties was rightfully theirs, a claim that the land deeds did not support, but that they were willing to back with muscle and intimidation where legal argument failed. Vernon's property was one of those along the creek. She heard about it first from Sheriff Cord, who came into the store one morning looking considerably more tired than usual, and who mentioned in the course of buying tobacco that there had been another fence cutting on the Slater property the previous night, the third in a month. "Is he all right?" she asked, and the way she asked it made Abel Cord look at her with a slightly raised eyebrow. "Vernon is fine," the sheriff said, angry, which is understandable, but fine. That afternoon, when Vernon came into town to report the incident formally at the sheriff's office, he stopped by the store on his way back to his wagon. He looked tired in a different way than usual, a tautness around the jaw, a set to his shoulders that was not quite weariness but was the physical attitude of a man who has been patient for a long time and is approaching the limits of his patience. "I heard," she said before he could say anything. "Small town," he said. "How bad is it?" He leaned against the counter, which he had never done before, and it struck her as significant, the small permission of taking a familiar posture in her presence. "I lost about 40 head last night. They went through the cut fence and were halfway into Harmon territory by the time my men found them this morning. Harmon will claim they were strays on his land, which gives him a legal argument, thin as it is, to hold them. Can Abel Cord get them back? He is working on it. But the Harmons have a lawyer in Abilene who knows how to slow things down." He was quiet for a moment. "I have been through worse than this. The ranch will not fail over it. But I do not like being pushed, and I do not like the feeling that someone thinks they can take what belongs to me just because they are louder about wanting it." There was something in the way he said the last part that was not just about the cattle, and she heard it, and she thought he might have heard himself say it, because a brief something passed across his face and he straightened up from the counter. "I should not be burdening you with this," he said. "You are not burdening me," she said, firmly enough that he stopped. "You are telling me something that matters to you. That is different." He looked at her for a moment with that direct, steady attention that she had come to think of as uniquely his, the look of someone who was actually seeing the thing in front of them rather than their idea of it. "Yes," he said, "it is different." The Harmon situation resolved itself in early August, not through any dramatic confrontation, but through a combination of Abel Cord's careful documentation, the testimony of 3 neighboring property owners whom the Harmons had also been encroaching on, and a circuit judge who came through Dusk Creek on his regular schedule and ruled firmly that the Harmon brothers' land claims beyond their existing deeds were without legal basis. The judge ordered the return of Vernon's cattle, assessed a fine against the Harmons for the fence damage, and made it clear in terms that even Cal Harmon could not misunderstand that further trespass would result in criminal charges. The town gathered outside the courthouse, such as it was, a room at the back of the sheriff's office, and there was a palpable loosening of collective tension as the ruling was announced. Fannie was there because Della had dragged her along, and she stood at the edge of the crowd and watched Vernon receive the news with the same contained composure he brought to everything. A single nod to the judge, a handshake with Abel Cord, and then he turned and his eyes found hers across the crowd. And he smiled, fully this time, not the small contained smile from the barn dance but something larger and more open, and it crossed the distance between them like a warm wind. Della made a sound beside her that was somewhere between a sigh and a laugh. That evening, Vernon appeared at Mrs. Doyle's boarding house, hat in hand, and asked whether Fanny might like to take a walk. She put on her good blue dress and went. They walked out to the edge of town, where the main street ended and the open land began, and the sky was doing what the Texas sky did in August evenings, burning itself through shades of orange and red and deep violet above the flat horizon, enormous and unhurried, a spectacle that had the quality of something being offered rather than merely happening. They walked without a set destination, which she recognized as different from his usual purposefulness, and after a while he said, "I have been thinking about something and I would like to say it plainly if you are willing to hear it plainly." "I prefer plainness," she said. "I know," he said. "That is one of the things I have been thinking about." He stopped walking and turned to face her, and the last light was behind him so she could not read his expression as clearly as she would have liked. "I have enjoyed your company, Miss Callahan, more than I expected to enjoy anyone's company again. I'm not going to be indirect about what that means to me, because I do not think you have any patience for indirection, and honestly neither do I. I would like to keep company with you, formally. I would like to know whether that is something you would consider." The sky behind him had turned to deep blue-purple, and the first stars were appearing, and the creek that ran along the southern edge of town made a sound she could just barely hear from where they stood. "Yes," she said simply, because he had asked plainly and deserved a plain answer. He breathed out slowly as though he had been holding something, and she realized he had been nervous, which surprised her and also moved her, that a man of this particular steadiness and composure had been nervous about asking her to keep company with him. "Good," he said. "That is very good." They stood in the cooling evening air and talked for another hour about nothing in particular, about the ranch and the town, and a book she had been reading that Mrs. Doyle kept on the parlor shelf, and about whether the summer would hold another week before the rains came. When he walked her back to Mrs. Doyle's, he said good night at the gate with his hat held correctly in his hand and a look on his face that she carried upstairs with her and held for a long time before she slept. August burned into September, and September into October, and the keeping company was, by the standards of Dust Creek, a matter of public record and considerable approbation. Vernon came to take her to supper on Friday evenings, to the boarding house, or occasionally to a meal at the hotel when he felt expansive. On Sunday afternoons, he took her out to see the ranch, driving the wagon at a pace that suggested they were in no hurry, which they were not. The first time she saw the ranch, she understood immediately what he had meant when he spoke about the land with that particular quality of love. The house was a solid, two-story structure of weathered timber, bigger than she had pictured, with a wide porch that faced south and a kitchen garden that had gone somewhat to seed since he had been managing alone. The cattle grazed on rolling grass that was still green despite the season, and the creek ran clear and quick along the south boundary, lined with cottonwood trees that had gone yellow in the autumn cold. It was beautiful in the way that practical things can be beautiful when they are also exactly right. She stood on the porch and looked at it and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, which was the specific sensation of seeing a future and recognizing it as yours. He stood beside her and watched her look at it, and she could feel him watching without turning to see his face, and there was no need to say anything about it. Some things do not need translation. But it was not all easy. Nothing worth having ever is. There was an evening in late October when they had supper at the hotel, and the conversation turned, as it sometimes did, to Clara. He had not spoken of her directly to Fanny, though the shape of Clara's absence was present in many things he said, in the careful way he spoke about the house, and the references to before that he sometimes made without elaborating. That evening something opened. She was not sure exactly what prompted it, but he spoke about Clara with an honesty that cost him something to produce, about how she had been, how they had fit together, how the winter that had taken her had been the worst 3 weeks of his life, and how for a long time afterward the mornings had been the hardest part, because mornings had always been when Clara was most present and most herself. Fanny listened without filling the silences, which was the most important thing she could do. When he stopped speaking, she said, "She sounds like someone worth grieving." He looked at the table for a moment. "Yes," he said, "she was." "Loving her well does not take anything away from what we are building," she said. "I am not competing with her. I am not asking you to set her aside. I am asking you to let there also be room for this." He looked up. The hotel dining room was quiet around them, a few other tables occupied, the light low and warm. His expression was the one she had come to recognize as his most honest one, the one with all the careful composure stripped away, just a man seeing something clearly and letting himself be seen in the act of seeing it. "There is room," he said. "There has been room since about the second time you corrected my change calculation at the general store." She laughed genuinely, the kind of laugh that surprised her with its warmth. "You were not adding the tariff on the coffee." "I was not," he agreed, and his face was fully open now, warm and wry in his, and she thought that she had been falling in love with him since that first day in the street when he had picked up her trunk without ceremony and called her on dragging it, and she had just been too sensible to admit it. On a Saturday evening in late November, when the first cold had settled over Dusk Creek, and the sky was the deep clean blue of a winter that means business, Vernon drove her out to the ranch after supper, and they sat on the south porch in their coats with cups of coffee, watching the stars come out over the flat dark land, and he said, in the direct, measured way he always said the things that mattered most, "I would like you to marry me, Fanny. I would like you to live here and build this with me and be my wife. I am not asking because I need someone to manage the house or because the practical circumstances require it. I am asking because I love you and because you are the most fully yourself of any person I have ever met, and because when you are not here the place feels like it is missing something essential." She set down her coffee cup on the porch rail very carefully. "I love you," she said, "and yes." He let out a breath, and then he reached over and took her hand, which was the first time he had done that, simply taken her hand without the formality of a dance or a gesture of assistance, just taken it because he wanted to hold it, and she turned her hand in his and felt the warmth of it in the cold evening air, and they sat like that for a long time while the stars multiplied overhead and the ranch spread out before them in the moonlight. They were married in the second week of December, 1878, in the church with the slightly sideways bell, which turned out to sound perfectly fine despite its tilt. Adeline Doyle cried with considerable feeling. Della Marsh wore her best bonnet and looked vindicated. Sheriff Cord attended and shook Vernon's hand with the solemn respect of a man who felt the occasion deserved it. Mabel Hurst came, and so did the Miller family, and a good portion of the town besides, because Dusk Creek was small enough that a wedding was a community event, and because people had watched the thing happening between Vernon Slater and Fannie Callahan over the past 7 months with the interested affection of those who are rooting for something. The ceremony was short and without ornamentation, which suited both of them. The Reverend William Page, a thin man with a large voice, read the words and they said the words back, and Vernon put a ring on her finger that had been his grandmother's, a simple silver band that fit as though it had been made for her. When they were told they were married and he kissed her, quietly and fully, the congregation in the small church made a sound that was somewhere between an exhale and a cheer. The celebration afterward at the Miller farm, because Martha Miller had insisted on providing the reception, and no one had the courage or the inclination to argue with her, went on through the afternoon and into the evening, with food enough for twice the crowd and the fiddle and guitar, providing an ongoing invitation to dance that most people accepted. Vernon and Fannie danced together more than once, and at one point found themselves in the center of the cleared floor, alone for a moment before others joined them, turning slowly in the lantern light, and she had her head against his shoulder and his arm was around her, and she thought, "This is the thing I came west for." Not the practical arrangement she had imagined, not the safe and sensible contract of a matrimonial notice. This specific, particular, irreplaceable thing. She moved her things to the ranch the following week, and the first morning she woke up in the house that was now hers, the light coming in through the bedroom window and falling across the wooden floor in long gold bars. She lay still for a moment and listened to Vernon in the kitchen below, the sound of the fire being built up and the coffee pot being set on, the particular sounds of a morning that was also hers now, and she felt something that she did not have an exact word for, not merely happiness, though it was that, but something more like rightness, the sensation of having arrived at a place where you were supposed to be. She got up and went downstairs, and he was at the stove in the gray winter light with his back to her, and when she came in he turned, and the expression on his face when he saw her there, in his kitchen in his morning, was the kind of expression that a person carries with them for a lifetime. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said, and went to stand beside him at the stove, shoulder to shoulder, to see what he was making. The winter passed, and it was a good winter, the kind of cold that stays honest and does not surprise you with sudden warmth and then take it back. Fannie threw herself into the ranch with the same focused practicality she brought to everything, and her energy and organization transformed certain aspects of the place that had quietly fallen into disorder in Vernon's solitary year. The kitchen garden was planned for spring, laid out on paper at the kitchen table with a care that Vernon watched with admiring interest. The household accounts, which had been kept in a haphazard way in a variety of notebooks and loose papers, were consolidated into a single clear ledger that she maintained with a precision that made Vernon laugh the first time he looked at it, a genuine laugh of the kind he had been producing more of lately. "You were born to run something," he said, looking over her shoulder at the ledger. "I was born to run a printing press," she said, "but the organizational principles are similar." "I believe that," he said, and kissed the top of her head with an easiness that said he had stopped being careful about it, had let the natural affection in him find its level. She still went into town 2 days a week to help at the general store, which Mabel Hurst had gratefully kept her on for, because she enjoyed the work and the contact with the town, and because there was no reason a woman who loved her husband and her ranch could not also have a use for her own abilities. Vernon had never suggested otherwise. It was one of the things she loved about him, that he had never looked at her competence as something that required management. In February, on a particularly cold night when the wind was coming down hard from the north, and they were both in front of the fire with books, she told him she thought she was expecting. He looked up from his book. He was very still for a moment, the way he was still when something had struck him more deeply than he had prepared for, and then he closed the book and set it aside and looked at her with an expression that she could not fully describe except to say that it had in it both the grief of the past and the warmth of the present and the hope of what was coming, all at once, layered in his face like the landscape he loved. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Not entirely," she said, "but fairly." He moved to sit beside her on the settle and took her hand and held it in both of his, turned it over in the firelight as though reading something in it. "How do you feel?" "Well," she said. "A little unsettled in the mornings, but well." "Good," he said. "Good." He was quiet for a moment. "I want this very much," he said, with the directness of a man choosing to show something that he might have protected. "I had let go of the idea of it. I did not think I would have this." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "You do," she said. He put his arm around her, and they stayed like that in the firelight, listening to the wind against the windows, while the future arranged itself quietly around them. Spring came to the ranch in the way it always did, all at once, and with a conviction that winter had been a temporary aberration. The kitchen garden went in, and it was a good one, tended by Fannie with the same systematic care she brought to the store's inventory. The cattle had wintered well, and the first calves of the season were a healthy crop that Vernon and his two hands, a quiet man named Pete Rourke and a younger one called Danny Cole, tended with the focused attention that calving season demands. The ranch was in good shape. The legal matter with the Harmons had held, and there had been no further incidents, the brothers having apparently decided that the cost of continued aggression was too high. As Fannie's pregnancy progressed through spring into summer, the town of Dust Creek collected around her in the way that small communities do, with advice and gifts and the occasional uninvited opinion, all of which she received with the same unflappable courtesy. Della Marsh appointed herself the primary source of practical assistance and arrived at the ranch every 2 weeks with supplies, conversation, and a thoroughness of attention that sometimes made Vernon feel slightly unnecessary in his own home, which Della pointed out was entirely missing the point. "She needs women around her for this," Della told him, with the frank manner she brought to everything. "You provide all the other things, let me provide this one." "I was not objecting," he said. "Good," Della said. "Then we understand each other." The summer of 1879 was long and hot and good. Fannie grew into her pregnancy with the same matter-of-fact steadiness she brought to everything else, though there were evenings when the heat and the weight of what she was carrying made her quiet in a way that Vernon had learned to read, and he would simply sit with her on the south porch and bring her cool water and not require conversation of her, which she appreciated more than she told him, though she suspected he knew. On a particularly still night in early July, lying in bed in the dark, she said, "I'm a little afraid." He was immediately fully awake because he always came to full attention at the honest things she said in the dark. "Of what?" he asked without alarm, just the steady readiness of someone who intends to face whatever it is with you. "Of all the things that can go wrong," she said. "Women die in childbirth, I know that. I have known that the whole time, but lately I feel it more." "Yes," he said. He did not tell her not to feel it, did not minimize it, because they were both people who did not do that to each other. "I know that fear," he said quietly. "I know it from the other side." She turned toward him in the dark. "I am not going anywhere," she said. "I am telling you I am afraid, not that I am going to leave." "I know," he said, "but I want you to know that I have thought about it too, and I have made my peace with the fear because the alternative is not having this, and I will not trade this for the absence of fear. You and what is coming, this is worth every fear." She put her hand on his chest and felt his heartbeat, steady and certain under her palm. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said. "Go to sleep." She did. The baby was born on a hot night in late September, 1879, with Doc Hendry in attendance and Della Marsh present and absolutely indispensable, and it was a boy. Vernon, who had been relegated to the other side of the house at Della's firm insistence, heard the first cry and stopped pacing mid-step, and then heard it again and let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. When Della came to get him, she had the expression of someone delivering good news that they have been enjoying in private for a few minutes and are now pleased to share. "She is fine," Della said. "She is tired and she is fine, and you have a son." He went in, and Fannie was propped against the pillows, exhausted and entirely herself, holding a red-faced and indignant-looking infant wrapped in white cotton, and she looked up at Vernon when he came in, and the expression on her face was the most purely complete thing he had ever seen. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby, who had quieted and was making small, serious expressions at nothing in particular, and then at Fannie, who was watching him watching the baby. "He is extraordinary," Vernon said. "He is 20 minutes old," she said. "Nevertheless," he said. She laughed tiredly and warmly. "What do you want to call him?" "We agreed on James," he said. "After your father." "James," she said, looking down at the baby. "James Slater." She tried the sound of it. "Yes, that is right." Vernon reached out and very carefully touched the baby's hand, which immediately and reflexively closed around his finger, and his face did something that Fannie had never seen it do before, an openness so complete and unguarded that it was almost difficult to look at directly, like looking at the sun. "Hello, James," he said very quietly. The years that followed were built from that moment. Not easily, because nothing that grows is built easily. There were dry summers and a hard winter in 1881, and the relentless press of work that a ranch demands. And there were disagreements between two strong-willed people who both thought they were right about things and were sometimes correct in this assessment, and sometimes were not. But they were built from that essential truth, from two people who had both survived losses that could have closed them to the world and had chosen, actively and repeatedly, not to be closed, who had found each other in a small, dusty Texas town by the kind of luck that you can only recognize as luck in retrospect, because in the moment it tends to look like a trunk that needs carrying. James grew from the red-faced infant into a bright and serious-eyed toddler who had his mother's coloring and his father's considered manner of regarding the world, as though weighing it before deciding on a response. He was 4 years old when Fannie told Vernon she was expecting again, on a quiet evening in the spring of 1883, and this time Vernon received the news with a different quality of feeling, not less moved, but more settled, the happiness of someone who has already learned that this particular joy can be trusted. The second child was a girl, born in November of that year, smaller than James had been and considerably louder about it from the first moment. They named her Margaret, after Vernon's mother, and she had Vernon's storm-gray eyes and Fannie's decisive manner, and from approximately the age of 6 months showed every sign of having inherited both parents' stubbornness in maximum concentration. James, who was 4.5 by the time Margaret arrived, approached the matter of his sister with the same thoughtful gravity with which he approached most things, and after studying her for several days, declared her acceptable, which Fannie and Vernon agreed was high praise. The ranch grew through the early 1880s with the careful, consistent growth of something tended by people who understood it. Vernon expanded the horse operation, which had always been the thing he was best at, and developed a reputation in the region for quality horses that brought buyers from Abilene and occasionally farther. Fannie continued her 2 days a week at the general store until Mabel Hurst retired in 1882, at which point Fannie bought the business from her. It was not a large investment by any measure. The store had never been a grand enterprise, but it was hers, organized exactly as she wanted it, run with a precision and warmth that made it the kind of place people came not just for goods, but for the particular quality of feeling that a place has when it is run by someone who takes genuine satisfaction in it. Vernon had been uncertain about the purchase at first, not because he doubted her ability, but because the work of running a business and a ranch and a household and 2 children seemed to him to be more than any person should carry. He said this to her directly, because they were people who said things directly. "I would rather do more and feel like myself than do less and feel like part of the furniture," she said. "I am not complaining. I am telling you that this is what I need." He thought about that. "Then tell me what you need from me to make it manageable," he said. She told him. He listened and adjusted and helped, and it worked, in the particular way that things work when 2 people are genuinely committed to finding an arrangement that suits both of them and are willing to be honest about what that requires. By the mid-1880s, Dust Creek had grown considerably, not into a city, but into something more substantial than the raw frontier town that Fannie had stepped off the stagecoach into in 1878. The population had roughly doubled. A second doctor had established a practice. The school now had 2 teachers and a new building. The hotel had been rebuilt. The church bell had been restrung and hung straight. There were 2 more general stores to compete with Fannie's, and she competed with them cheerfully and successfully. because she knew her customers by name and knew what they needed sometimes before they knew it themselves. The Harmon brothers had sold their spread and moved on by 1882, the legal judgment having made their particular style of operation difficult to sustain. No one in Dusk Creek expressed much grief about this. Sheriff Abel Cord retired in 1884 and was replaced by a younger man named Frank Hooper, who had trained under Cord and had the same patient, methodical approach to law that Cord had practiced. The transition was smooth. Small towns that survive are the ones that build institutions that outlast the individuals who create them. Vernon and Fannie attended the church together on Sundays, went to dances at the Miller farm when they were held, and were present at the births and deaths and harvests and difficulties of their neighbors in the reciprocal way of people who belong somewhere. They were not the flashiest family in Dusk Creek, were not the richest or the most prominent, but they were perhaps the most genuinely rooted, because they were rooted not just in the land or the town, but in each other. And that kind of foundation holds through things that shake more superficial structures. On an evening in the autumn of 1885, 7 years after Fannie had stepped off that stagecoach, they sat on the south porch of the ranch house, the same porch they had sat on that first night when he had told her he loved her under the enormous Texas stars. James was 6 and had gone to bed. Margaret was not quite 2 and was asleep in the room above them. The air was the clear, cold, brilliant air of a Texas autumn night, and the stars were doing what they always did. Fannie had a cup of tea and Vernon had coffee, and they were not talking about anything in particular, which was one of the things about 7 years with a person, the comfortable depth of a silence that does not need filling. "Are you happy?" he asked after a while. She considered the question seriously, which was how she considered all serious questions. "Yes," she said, "not in the way I imagined happiness when I was young, when I thought it was something that would arrive all at once and announce itself. It is quieter than I expected, more like a condition than an event." "That is a good description," he said. "I came to Texas because I had run out of other options," she said, half smiling. "I think about that sometimes. How close I came to not being here. The stagecoach came every week," he said. "There would have been other chances. But it would not have been the same stagecoach," she said. "It would not have been that particular Tuesday in April with that specific trunk being too heavy. Small things. I think about small things." He reached over and took her hand, which was what he did, which he had done 10,000 times in 7 years and which still held the quality of a choice, of a voluntary reaching across the distance between two separate people. "I am glad the trunk was heavy," he said. She laughed. "So am I," she said. They sat like that in the cooling dark, with the ranch spread out before them and the children asleep above them and the stars making their old slow wheel overhead. And the future was a settled thing, a known and cultivated and beloved thing. And there was nothing left to want that they did not already have, except perhaps more time in which to have it. And that seemed, on a night like this, to be entirely possible. There was one more thing, though, that the autumn of 1885 brought them, and it came in the form of a visit from Fannie's brother, Thomas Callahan, who arrived in Dusk Creek with his wife, Eleanor, and their 3 children on the Thursday stage at the end of October. Thomas had written to say they were coming, had been corresponding with Fannie for 2 years about the possibility of coming west. He had been working at a mill in Ohio that was struggling, and the opportunity to start over in Texas had taken hold of him, the way frontier opportunity tended to take hold of people who had run the same numbers one too many times and found them wanting. Vernon had arranged for them to stay at the ranch while Thomas looked at land, which he did for the first week, riding out each day with Pete Rourke, who knew the available properties as well as anyone. Eleanor, who was a warm and practical woman who had heard a great deal about Fannie's life in Texas, and seemed to have formed high expectations that the reality was meeting rather than failing, spent the week getting to know the ranch and helping with the children and the general running of the house in the cheerful, efficient way of a woman who is comfortable anywhere she plants herself. On the first evening after supper, Thomas and Vernon sat on the porch and talked for a long time about land and cattle and the economics of ranching, and Fanny listened from inside through the open window while she and Alina put the children to bed, and she heard Thomas say, in his measured Ohio way, "She seems different. Better. I mean that well, not as a criticism of how she was before. She is entirely herself," Vernon said. "She always was. She just has somewhere to put it now." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "You take good care of her," he said. "She takes good care of herself," Vernon said. "I just try not to get in the way of that." Fanny pressed her lips together against a smile that she did not want Alina to see her having for no apparent reason. Thomas found his land in the second week, a parcel of 200 acres 12 miles northwest of Dusk Creek that had a good house already on it, and soil that Thomas, who had been reading about dry farming since he had decided to come west, was genuinely excited about. The price was fair and the terms were manageable, and by the end of October the Callahan family was settling into their new property, with the chaotic energy of a family making itself at home. Christmas of 1885 was the largest gathering in Fanny's memory. Both families at the ranch, children underfoot in every room, Vernon at the head of the table, with the expression of a man who has reached a domestic abundance he had stopped expecting, and who is not taking a moment of it for granted. Fanny sat at the other end and looked down the length of the table at all of it, the food and the faces and the noise, and then caught Vernon's eye and saw him looking at her with that direct, certain attention, and she smiled, and he smiled, and the whole crowded room with all its warmth was simply the setting for that small, private exchange between two people who knew each other all the way down. James sat beside his father and was talking with great seriousness about the horse he had been promised for his next birthday, laying out his argument in the methodical way that would probably serve him well in whatever he chose to do with his life. Margaret, who was 2 1/4 and had no patience for being still, was in her mother's lap demanding pieces of bread and periodically announcing observations about the room that no one had asked for. Thomas told a long and winding story about a difficulty he had had with a fencing supplier that was entirely too earnest to be as funny as he thought it was. But Alina caught Fanny's eye across the table, and they shared the private, rueful affection that two women can exchange about the men they love. Vernon refilled everyone's glasses and cut the pie that Adeline Doyle had sent over from town, which was mince, and which was excellent, and someone asked Tom Marsh, who had come with Della for the occasion, to play the fiddle, and he obliged, and the children danced badly and enthusiastically in the cleared space by the window while the adults clapped time. The snow that had been threatening all day started during the meal, light and steady, covering the ranch in white silence that the warm windows and the fiddle music made more beautiful by contrast. Vernon went out at one point to check on the horses and came back in with snow on his hat and shoulders, shaking himself in the doorway, and Fanny handed him a towel and he dried his face and said, "Everything is fine," with the economy of a man who had said those particular words many times and meant them every time. Later, after the guests had left or been settled into beds throughout the house, and after the children were asleep, and after the dishes were done in the companionable quiet that domestic evenings end in, Vernon and Fanny stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the snow that was still falling on the dark ranch, covering everything in an evenness that made the whole world look simplified and clean. He stood behind her with his arms around her, her back against his chest, and they were both looking at the same thing, the snow on the fence rails and the barn roof and the black shapes of the cottonwoods along the creek in the distance, and the silence was the full, rich silence of a house full of sleeping people that you love. 7 years, he said. "And counting," she said. His arms tightened slightly around her. "I did not think I would be here," he said, and she knew he meant not just the ranch and the house and the Christmas full of people. He meant in this particular life, with this particular quality of being present in it. "I thought I was done with certain things." "You were wrong," she said, which was not a rebuke but simply the truth. "I was entirely wrong," he said, with a warmth in his voice that she felt against the back of her head. "Fortunately, you were very patient with me about it." "I was not patient," she said. "I was strategic." He laughed, and it was the best sound in the room, in the house, in the snow-covered night. "Same result," he said. They stood at the window and watched the snow until it stopped, sometime in the small hours, and then they went upstairs to their room, and the house was quiet around them, and the snow lay clean and white across everything, and the creek ran somewhere under the ice, patient and certain, the way things that are truly rooted run. In the years that followed, Dust Creek grew, and so did the Slater family, and so did everything they had built. The store expanded to include a postal function in 1887, when the town's growing population made it practical, and Fannie managed both enterprises with the same systematic intelligence that had always characterized her work. Vernon's horse operation had by 1888 achieved a regional reputation that brought buyers from Fort Worth and once from as far as Denver, and the ranch's financial position was solid in the way that solid things become when they are built slowly and carefully on good ground. James learned to ride by the time he was 6 and was on a horse of his own by 7, as promised, a calm bay quarter horse that he named Colonel, with the gravity of someone naming something important. Margaret, who had no patience for gravity of any kind, learned to ride by simply getting on any horse that held still long enough and declining to fall off, a method that terrified Vernon and impressed Pete Rourke, who said she had the best natural seat he had seen in a child. Thomas's farm 12 miles out prospered, more slowly than he had hoped and more surely than he had feared, and the two families made the journey between each other's properties enough times that the children grew up as close as siblings. Eleanor's third child, a boy named Peter, was born in 1886, and Margaret declared him her particular charge and watched over him with a possessive care that made everyone laugh. In 1889, Fannie hired 2 women to help manage the store and took on the additional role of teaching 2 days a week at the school, which had outgrown its second teacher, and where the children of the newer families needed instruction that the existing teachers did not have time to provide. She taught reading and arithmetic, and the particular skill of clear written expression that she had absorbed from years surrounded by her father's printing press. She was a good teacher, demanding and patient in equal measure, and the children mostly worked hard for her because she was obviously on their side. On the last day of school in June of 1889, one of her students, a boy of 11 named Arthur Pendergast, whose father had come from Georgia 2 years before, and who had arrived at school speaking and reading poorly, and was now among the best readers in the classroom, gave her a small painting he had made of the school building, rendered in the careful and slightly lopsided way of a child who has worked very hard on something. She looked at it for a long time, and then she told him it was excellent, which it was, in all the ways that mattered. She brought it home and showed Vernon, who looked at it carefully and said, "He has a good eye for proportion." "He does," she said. "He works very hard." She paused. "I like teaching." "I know," he said. "I am glad I stayed here," she said. It was not a non sequitur, though it might have sounded like one. He understood. "So am I," he said. She put Arthur Pendergast's painting on the shelf in the parlor, where it stayed for the next 40 years. In the summer of 1890, when James was 10 and Margaret was 7, Vernon took the whole family on a 3-day trip to Fort Worth, which was the largest city either child had ever seen, and which produced in both of them a specific kind of excited disorientation that manifested differently according to their natures. James catalogued everything he saw with the systematic attention he brought to all new information. Margaret simply ran from one thing to the next with a thoroughness that required both parents to maintain continuous visual contact with her. On the second evening after the children were in bed at the hotel, Vernon and Fannie walked along the street outside in the warm summer night, the city noise around them after the quiet of the ranch, and she took his arm in the way she had not in a long time, the easy claiming of the gesture. "I forgot what cities sound like," she said. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "Cincinnati." She thought about it honestly. "Parts of it," she said. "The smell of my father's press, the sound of the city in the morning, which is different from anything else. But no, not in the way of wanting to be there instead of here, only in the way of remembering that it was mine once." "You can have more than one thing that was yours," he said. "I know," she said. "I have more than one thing that is mine." He covered her hand on his arm with his other hand, there in the Fort Worth street, with the noise of the city around them and the summer night above them. And it was the same gesture it had always been, the reaching across the space between two people, the choosing. They went home to Dusk Creek at the end of the week, and the children pressed their faces to the stagecoach windows as the familiar landscape came back into view, the rolling grass and the particular sky and the line of the creek along the south, and Margaret said, "There is our creek," with a proprietary satisfaction that made Vernon smile with a fullness that Fanny loved to see, the evidence of a happiness so settled it had stopped needing to announce itself. There was our creek. Yes, all of it theirs. The autumn of 1891 brought the third pregnancy, which neither of them had expected at this point, but which both received with a happiness that had a rueful edge to it. The particular happiness of an unexpected gift that arrives when your life is already full and makes you realize that full is a more flexible condition than you had supposed. Fanny was 35, which her doctor noted was worth being careful about, and she was careful, without being managed by the caution, which was her way. The baby was born in March of 1892, a second boy, smaller than James had been, with Fanny's copper-red hair and her green eyes, who cried with a determination that suggested he had decided from the first moment to have opinions about everything. They named him Edward after no one in particular, because the name suited him and he was his own person from the start. James, who was 12 and deeply sensible, received this new brother with the measured approval he had shown Margaret, arriving at a similar conclusion after similar study. Margaret, who was 8 and had no patience for measured responses, declared Edward immediately hers as well, which established a dynamic that would persist for the next several decades. Vernon held Edward on the evening of his birth, in the lamplight of the bedroom where both his other children had been born, and looked at this third small person with an expression that Fanny could no longer fully see without something becoming full in her own chest, because it was the expression of a man who had once believed certain doors were permanently closed to him, looking at the evidence that he had been entirely wrong, and being entirely and without reservation glad of it. "3," he said quietly. "3," she agreed from the pillow. "Remarkable," he said, in the tone of someone who has genuinely never gotten over being surprised by good things. She reached up and touched his face, and he leaned into her hand briefly, naturally, the way he always did. "Remarkable," she said. By the mid-1890s, Dusk Creek had transformed further into a town of the type that the frontier could actually sustain long-term. Not the rough, transient settlement of the earliest years, but a community with institutions and families and a history. The original settlers were aging, and their children were growing up knowing nothing but Dusk Creek, and the town was being shaped more and more by those born into it than by those who had arrived seeking something. Fanny's store had 2 full-time employees and a third part-time one, and she spent more of her time teaching than behind the counter, though she was always present on certain days, and the regulars knew when those days were, and arranged their shopping accordingly. Vernon had added a third hired hand to the ranch by 1894, and had recently taken on a young man named Isaac Webb as an apprentice of sorts, a 19-year-old from San Antonio who had a gift for horses and a desire to learn the business properly, and who proved his worth within the first month, and within the first year had become nearly indispensable. James, at 15, was increasingly working alongside his father on the ranch, with the purposefulness of someone who had already decided what he wanted and was learning it systematically. He was a quiet young man, serious and fair-minded, and he had his father's particular quality of paying real attention to the world, which made him good with both animals and people. Margaret, at 13, was something else entirely. She was bright and fast and opinionated, and had her mother's habit of going directly at the center of a thing, and she had decided she wanted to be a doctor, which was not a common ambition for a girl in rural Texas in 1896, but which no one in the Slater household thought it appropriate to discourage, because her parents were who they were, and they had not raised their children to believe that what was uncommon was therefore impossible. Edward, who was 4 and very much himself, filled every room he entered with a particular quality of motion and commentary, and was learning to read with a speed that made his teachers blink, and that his mother noted with a quiet, private pride that she kept somewhat contained, because it was not good to spoil children. In the spring of 1897, Vernon and Fannie sat together on the south porch in the early evening, not as they had sat in their early years, two people finding their way toward each other across carefully maintained distance, but as they had sat for many years now, close and comfortable and entirely at ease, with the ranch spread before them and the creek catching the last light, and the voices of their children in various parts of the house creating the particular domestic music of a life being fully lived. Vernon was 47 and Fannie was 41, and they were in the particular territory of a marriage that has gone deep, where the original rush and uncertainty have long since resolved into something more durable and more complex, where you know each other's flaws as well as your own, and have made the ongoing, active decision that the whole person is what you want, flaws included, because you would not recognize the person without them. They had disagreed over the years, sometimes sharply. There had been a period in 1886 when a decision about the ranch finances had created a real friction between them that had taken 2 weeks and several honest conversations to resolve. There had been times when the weight of what they were both carrying had found no good place to set itself down, and had made them short with each other. There had been one night in 1893, during a particularly difficult winter, when they had gone to bed angry and lain in the dark on their respective sides and both known that the distance was real and both been too exhausted and too proud to close it, until he had simply reached out his hand in the dark without saying anything and she had taken it without saying anything, and that had been sufficient. That was the thing about it. That had always been sufficient. "What are you thinking about?" he asked in the evening light. "Nothing specific," she said. "The whole of it, how it got from there to here." "From a stagecoach stop in April," he said. "From a stagecoach stop in April," she confirmed. "With a heavy trunk." "With a very heavy trunk," he agreed. The light on the creek was going from gold to silver as the sun dropped behind the flat horizon, and the cottonwoods made their evening sound, which was a kind of settling, and somewhere in the house Margaret was explaining something to Edward with considerable feeling, and James's voice came from the direction of the barn, and the whole ranch breathed around them in the particular way it always did at this hour, slow and full and real. "I did not know," she said, "when I got off that stagecoach, I did not know any of this was what was waiting." "Neither did I," he said. "I was watching someone drag a trunk across a dusty street in the wrong direction and thinking that someone should tell her before she pulled a muscle." "That was the beginning," she said. "That was the beginning," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, which she had done 10,000 times and which still felt like the right place for her head to be, and he put his arm around her, which he had done 10,000 times and which still felt like a choice, the same reaching across the distance between two people that it had always been, the same voluntary movement toward, not because it was required or habitual, though it was both of those things, but because it was wanted, which was the thing that made the difference. Stars were beginning to appear, the same stars that had been overhead on the first night he had told her he loved her, the same enormous Texas sky that had been there when she stepped off the stagecoach in the spring of 1878 with $6.40 and a heavy trunk, and not the slightest idea of what was waiting for her in this small, sun-beaten, improbable town. The creek ran south, the way it always had. The ranch was quiet in the best way. Their children's voices moved through the house. Everything was where it was supposed to be.